Hello, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Laura Beth Ezel with Utility Dive Studio ID, and I will be moderating today's webinar from Aspirational to Operational, Meeting ESG, Net Zero, and Business Goals. Before we begin, I'd like to go through a few housekeeping items. At the bottom of your screen are some widgets you can use to enhance your webinar experience. All widgets are resizable and movable, so feel free to move them around to optimize your desktop space. Slides will advance automatically throughout the presentation. To enlarge the slides, click the Enlarge Slides button in the top right corner of your presentation window. Now, we encourage you to submit questions at any time throughout the presentation using the Q&A widget. We will try to answer your questions during the webinar. However, if we run out of time to answer your question fully, it will be answered later via email, so please know that we do capture all questions. Now, after the webinar, you can access the on-demand recording of the webinar using the same link from today's live event. Well, now I would like to introduce our panelists today. Darwin Nozdrin Plotnitsky is Managing Director Americas for Copperleaf, a leading global provider of advanced decision analytics software. Also joining us are Andrea Rozelle, Energy, Sustainability, and Infrastructure Canadian Market Lead for Guidehouse, and Tom Wasik, Vice President, Asset Management for Electra Utilities. Well, welcome, panelists. Thank you for being here today. So let's get started. Now, in the 21st century, utilities face a major challenge. Most utilities have made strong commitments to advanced environmental, social, and governance considerations, collectively called ESG. Now, this means they've set ambitious goals, such as achieving net zero greenhouse gas emissions and delivering broader benefits to the communities they serve. Meeting these goals demands a comprehensive, long-term vision for capital investments. Utilities must plan and regulators must approve a strategic portfolio of capital projects that deliver on ESG commitments. Furthermore, utilities must embed the value of ESG into how ongoing business and operational decisions are made. Now, this webinar will explain how advanced decision analytics software can give utilities a consistent framework for valuing ESG across all types of investments and decisions. This supports an optimal investment strategy that achieves ESG goals alongside business and customer objectives. To begin our discussion, I'd like to ask Darwin to set the context here. So why has it become so complicated for utilities to make important strategic decisions, especially about capital investments?
Yeah, thank you, Laura Beth. So I think it has become increasingly difficult for utilities to make these strategic decisions about capital investments for several reasons. So first of all, historically, utilities had to deliver on three objectives, and that is to provide their services reliably, affordably, and safely. Now, this is how they were judged by their regulators, their investors, and their customers. However, now, with governments putting pressure on all the industries to deliver on their ESG strategy, and on top of it, in the face of extreme climate events that you and I, all of us, have unfortunately experienced recently, and together with the rise of activist investors, all these external forces, it's no longer possible to just do business as usual, per se. So utilities now having to include additional considerations to all of their decisions and factoring in three more top-level objectives, and that is sustainability, flexibility, and resilience across their entire system and all of their decisions. So you can imagine, right, that is a doubling in the number of top-level objectives, which just complicates every single decision hugely. So that's first, the objectives doubling. Now, secondly, is some of these criteria that they now have to value are more difficult to measure than others. So, we all know utilities are having to compare hard costs like financial and resource impact, which they're very well accustomed to dealing with. And now they have to compare that with environmental and community benefits as well. So when it comes to figuring out when a utility should harden, for instance, or relocate a flood or fire-prone substation, Instead of that, develop a microgrid with renewables and storage to serve that grid section. Those two choices is not exactly apparent. Which choice will serve best their collective objectives for the utility? And so those kind of questions or decisions around which project should I do, when to do them, are harder to answer without being able to quantify the likely sustainability, flexibility, and resilience impact on every option, and along it side by side with the traditional measures like reliability, affordability, and safety considerations. And finally, the last point, I think, is understanding that utility and really any organization in the world cannot do it all at once to achieve all their ambitions in ESG and net zero goals. There's just too much asked of them to do and too much transformation to happen all at once. And so being able to answer these questions of where do I invest, when, how, being able to answer that confidently and consistently and optimize their investment planning is just more important than ever, so that they can direct and utilize their financial, human resources, their most valuable resources in the most optimal way. So to me, that is why advanced decision analytics solutions like Copperleaf's has become an essential tool for utility planning, so that companies can strike that balance between the investment in innovation on one hand and the sustainment required to run today's day-to-day operations, so that not only can we get to net zero, be a force for social good, and we can run today's business and operations safely, reliably, and affordably.
Yeah, great points there. Thank you for that. So, now let's see what decisions informed by consistent ESG valuation can look like for utilities. So, Tom, I understand that electric utilities has been using Copperleaf Decision Analytics since 2014. So how has this affected how ESG gets included in your utilities investment decisions?
Well, thank you. So that's absolutely right. We have been utilizing decision-making tools like Copperleaf for a while now and have been evolving them with the changing requirements that are put upon us. And so one of the greatest values that I think Copperleaf provides for us using this tool is provide a level playing field across a wide range of different investment portfolios. And so we are able to properly evaluate the value that each particular investment brings and compare and contrast different types of optimization scenarios that we can run. And so that allows us to blend together traditional investments of renewal of poles and transformers with some of the more emerging technologies, including technologies and sustainability, into our portfolio. And that allows us to find those opportunities to integrate those particular once previously thought of as periphery investments now into our day-to-day operational decision making. And so, I think the best benefit that we can bring out of these investments is to find those opportunities and demonstrate the value over time. And that's the other benefit that Copperleaf provides us, is we take a look at the full effect of the investment over its entire lifetime. And what we find is these environmentally driven sustainable solutions often have a higher upfront cost, but they have a lower lifetime cost if you look at it in terms of the bigger picture. And Copperleaf as a tool allows us to evaluate that against all of the other traditional solutions. So one example we have that we've recently implemented is incorporating how to take more full effect of demand energy responses or distributed energy resources, and how to incorporate those into our day-to-day practices with respect to energy transactions. And so we have this project that is cutting edge, it's emerging, it's incorporating these new energy resources into the mix. And we're looking at how to incorporate and utilize those resources through different tools so that we can consider the potential of offsets onto regular traditional distribution systems. And so what the tool allows us to do is evaluate the proposition of the business case of such emerging technologies against the traditional capital investments that we would have otherwise made if those technologies weren't available.
Yeah, that's just great examples there, and important for communities and customers to get this information too. So thanks, Tom. So in one sense, incorporating ESG into utility decisions makes these decisions more complex because it doubles the number of top-level objectives. But in another sense, applying a consistent value framework to all decisions can make it easier for utilities to manage this complexity by simplifying the process of clarifying which solutions would be most beneficial. So, Andrea, what does it mean for utilities to expand their definition of value, and how can that help them embrace ESG in a more maybe holistic and practical way? Andrea?
Sure. There's really two elements at play here. First is expanding the definition of value, and that's expanding it to include both risks and benefits of projects from that ESG lens. So risks could be risks of making an investment that's more innovative or costly, but it could also be reflecting the risks that are associated with making traditional investments that may not be prudent given what the changing economic and climatic landscape is. And then when we think on the value side, there's a lot of opportunity to look at the value of potential opportunities from that ESG perspective. So if we think about sustainability, there's the reduction of GHG emissions. And we also spoke about adding the benefit of resiliency and looking at the value that that provides to specific projects. The City View Microgrid project, which Tom's going to speak about in more detail later, is a great example of where, when we consider those additional benefits of ESG, we're able to help clarify what the value is of that project. And the second element of play when we think about expanding the definition of value comes from building bridges across the utility so that different departments can discuss the value of projects in the same way. So this is going to help us move away from utility decisions that are being made siloed by department. Different departments have often had different ways of understanding and quantifying value. So if we consider energy efficiency and demand response as an example, some departments have viewed this primarily as revenue reduction, and that might lead to overlooking the value of reliability and sustainability, and even in some cases, flexibility, and the benefits, of course, of customers' bill savings. A consistent and comprehensive framework, which includes valuing ESG as well as the other important factors, can help decision makers bridge those internal silos. So we may reframe energy efficiency programs as customer-focused solutions, and that can help shift the perception of value, and it highlights the social value of ESG. Similarly, programs to increase electrification can help customers meet their own ESG goals by reducing fossil fuel use at home, work, and at school.
Yeah, that makes sense. But, Andrea and Tom, how can that translate into new metrics that utilities can apply across the board?
Thanks. So if we go back to what Dewan was explaining at the very top of the conversation, we talked about 3 additional top-level objectives. And if we look at how those top-level objectives correlate to the ways we measure value, then we're able to start to consider how to incorporate those objectives into our value framework. The key is to developing value metrics which are able to quantify the value and risks associated with those additional 3 objectives. If we think first about sustainability, we can consider quantifying the value of GHG reductions and long-term economic and operational viability, and quantifying the risks on the other side associated with climate change. So sustainability now becomes everybody's business. It's not just the sustainability team. All projects are going to have to consider the impacts of GHG emissions and the associated value of the physical and transitional climate risks which may exist. If we think, for example, about an AMI project, we understand that there is value associated with the reduction of the number of truck rolls, which are going to be required to collect meter data. But that same project also has an associated GHG emission reduction value, which should be captured and included as we consider the value of that project. I'm going to pass it over to Tom to talk about flexibility and resilience.
Absolutely. So one of the main elements that we've been thinking about recently is how to increase the flexibility of the grid. And we need to make sure that that flexibility is available for the future to accommodate the shifting demand patterns and increased intermittency of generation in the mix. And so there are multiple ways to route and store power on the grid, and we're thinking about how to incorporate those capabilities into our plans as we move forward. We're also looking at multiple sources of power connected to the grid and behind the meter. And these emerging technologies are something that we're starting to see increasing numbers in. And so we want to make sure we have an opportunity to participate and, if possible, control how to best gain the benefits from those particular resources. And more importantly, we're looking at how to keep the customer satisfied and being an ally to enable them to achieve their ESG goals. And so a lot of the focus, although we've been thinking about our own practices in-house about how we can do things more effectively and sustainably, we also want to be there for our customers in terms of being able to support them in their own initiatives and their goals to be more sustainable. And then finally, we are seeing a significant increase in terms of the number and frequency and impact of weather-related adverse situations and events. And so developing resilience in the grid is something that is of not just importance to us as managers of the utility, but also to our customers that are expecting that we're making the necessary changes in order to be able to withstand some of these events. And so what we're looking at is how to develop the necessary measures and metrics in order to be able to accommodate those. So we have to adapt. We have to make sure that the system is ready. We have to make sure that the business and the grid and the operations and conditions reflect those changing needs. But to do it in a prudent and economic way is also very challenging. And so, from a resilience standpoint, we look at that as a system's ability to prevent, withstand, adapt to, and more importantly, quickly recover to events that can't be planned. And so what we're looking for is how to make sure that when we develop the system, those future considerations and increasing considerations are taken into account in a very effective way. And we also look at that in contrast to reliability. And so how do you make sure that as you're doing that, you're maintaining the energy delivery and understanding the standard operating conditions as we have it today? So as you look forward to making things more hardened to withstand storms, you also have to keep an eye on the day-to-day operations to make sure that the existing system is there. And so we use tools like Copperleaf to help us identify the value of these investments, especially future-looking resilience with respect to risk, costs, benefits that are just beyond our traditional utility sense. And so what we want to look at is how to include avoided direct and indirect costs, especially to some of our service providers, our customers, the public in general. And from a disruption standpoint, when we look at the impacts of these events, how to withstand that over a longer period of time, and how do we make sure that as a distributor, we can be reliable to deliver those things. When we look at our methodologies of selecting investments, we do have a value of resilience incorporated into our value measures. And that's really important because it goes into every investment that we evaluate to determine what can we possibly do to make sure that that is incorporated into all of our decisions that we make moving forward.
Yeah, thank you both for your thoughts there. And yeah, valuing resilience is even more important as we see, increasing severe storms like that winter storm Uri in Texas in 2021, or the Pacific Northwest and BC heat dome in summer 2021. So great points there. Planning utility capital investments takes a lot of people and a lot of time to accomplish. So, Dawan, what impact can advanced decision analytics have on utility planning processes?
Yeah, I think both Andrea and Tom actually have touched on a couple of these concepts. And advanced decision analytics solutions like ours really offers three benefits that combine to optimize the utility planning processes. And so basically, we enable organizations to expand their concept of value to include ESG alongside more typical financial reliability measures. And then we embed that expanded value framework into their day-to-day decision-making and long-term planning consistently across the entire organization to eliminate the silos that Andrea talked about. And then finally, we provide them with a means to demonstrate to the highest value plan to all of their stakeholders with confidence and transparency. And what this means in terms of tangible advantages for the utility is, one, is easier alignment to get to the right decision. And that is made possible by having clearer measurement and shared understanding across different departments of ESG-related benefits, and alongside with the more traditional financial reliability consequences. Now, secondly is faster to get to those aligned and best decisions and plans. Because, for instance, we've seen in our clients that they have been able to cut planning time by half, and sometimes much more. And in fact, some of our clients have seen an 80% reduction in time to revise their plans. So what that means is they're a lot more agile when it comes to scenario analysis, replanning that's needed when things invariably change on them at an ever increasing speed. And finally, it's the clearer communication, both internally and externally, on why their plans are the most optimal. And so on the internal front, consensus on investment choices, that silo that we talked about earlier, to be able to get everyone onto the same even playing field, as Tom was mentioning, so that we can get to a consensus on what are the best investment choices for the organization as a whole, and not just for individual departments one at a time. And then when you look at externally, that external communication, easier demonstration on the ESG benefits of an investment to make regulatory interactions and approvals easier on IRPs and rate cases and such. So, and I think it's actually important to zoom into that external communications front a little bit, because there are multiple different stakeholders there. So for investor-owned utilities or IOUs, right, demonstrating tangible results on ESG and making progress on their ESG strategy. That's really important, but they have to do it while running an economically sound business. So organizations, as we all know, we can't survive if we're constantly losing money while doing good for society. This is not either or, it's both. We have to do both, doing good for society and being profitable to be able to maintain investor confidence. And for utilities, this means creating more value for every dollar spent while they're making progress towards their net zero goals as well. So I want to share a very brief example, because one of our longtime clients, and it's such a good story, they've been working to deliver on their net zero strategy over the last multiple years, and they've been using Copperleaf to deliver higher value on from their portfolios of investment. And as well, not only are they evaluating every project's financial benefits and costs and reliability and safety in the same system, and that, of course, is Copperleaf, they're also estimating their capital projects, all of the carbon footprint for every single one of their capital projects, all in the same system alongside all the traditional measures. And so that really is powerful, because when you're doing accounting financially and the carbon accounting all in one place, sustainability becomes everybody's business. It's on the same footing as your financial results and safety. And so the results also speak for themselves for this utility. Now, they were able to cut their capital carbon by 61% against their 2010 baseline across their entire business. And especially one of their sites even reported 74% capital carbon reduction at the same time with a 42% cost reduction. So placing the organizations well on its tracks to meet their 2030 net zero targets. So you can imagine how that is really music to investors' ears, right?
Yeah, absolutely. That's some incredible goals there. So that we'll need an update on that. So Tom, can you give us some examples of how Electra Utilities has been embedding ESG into decisions, and how does this help you get beyond the low-hanging fruit of ESG?
That's a great question. So, we have environmental and sustainable value measures incorporated into our value framework. We included both benefits and risks to make sure that we capture opportunities, as well as understand the risks of inaction if we don't proceed with specific investments and plans. And so over the years, we have been incorporating specific investments. A couple good examples are some of the resiliency that we talked about in the previous points around hardening the system. And so through our examination of various different projects, we did identify several areas in our system that are most susceptible to storms and damage. And so what we elected to do is incorporate not only the primary driver of upgrading our infrastructure that is traditionally reliability, but we also recognized the impacts of climate change in those particular assets. And so we know that as the condition of assets deteriorates over time, they're more susceptible to damage during major storms. But there are also specific geographic areas that are most susceptible to the storms, and helping us identify those locations, incorporating those values into the business cases helps us identify and prioritize where we go ahead and invest to harden the system. So that program has been quite effective in terms of being able to help us identify where those higher priority, sustainable, climate change addressing investments can be made. Another example is where we intertied emerging technologies with current processes and challenges we have, also in a very localized area where we incorporated microgrids. And so we have a couple initiatives, and one I'll explain to you is the CityView microgrid solution, where we have been able to apply newer and emerging technologies to control smaller sections of the grid through automation and various different resources available to us to not only improve the reliability in those areas, but offset the need to build excessive redundancy in order to support the performance in those particular elements. So intertwining emerging technologies, looking at some of the additional value stacks that sustainability brings to those particular elements while offsetting sort of traditional investments has been something that we've been trying to incorporate more and more into our practices. And I think those two examples demonstrate how the use of tools like Copperleaf allow us to identify and prioritize where those investments yield the most amount of value for our shareholders and our residents and businesses that we support in our service area.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Thanks for sharing those examples there, Tom. And so utility decisions are made by people. So changing the way decisions get made involves some culture change, some change management. So Andrea, what's important for utilities to consider about the human side of changing how ESG is valued and incorporating it into strategy and decisions?
There are really two parts of the human side of change that we need to consider. The first is cultural, as you mentioned, and then the second is organizational. Cultural change is going to be a big challenge. It's going to require that utilities shift their attitude towards investment risk. Utilities are typically accustomed to getting a guaranteed rate of return on investments, and that's led to a culture of low risk appetite. Utilities are more comfortable as a result with investments that fall into familiar buckets. And they have a tendency to believe that those familiar buckets are better or more reliable than some of the new investment buckets. But that culture could be flawed as we consider ESG and the associated energy transition and the changes that are going to occur for utilities. The traditional utility culture may lead to overlooking some big risks with potentially high costs and consequences. Things like customers leaving the system or the impacts of climate change, fuel cost availability and volatility, possible future carbon tax or other new requirements, and customer and regulator backlash against utilities that aren't adequately investing to enhance their ESG programs. Utilities are starting to see what they could lose by not valuing and investing in ESG, and also what they could gain by valuing ESG within their other investments. And they're starting to shift to a more customer-focused utility culture. So in the old way, utilities were rate-basing almost everything, and they saw customers primarily as revenue. But we're starting to see utilities focus on customers from a what's the customer value perspective, and including the kind of world that their customers want to live in when they think about the services and products that they're delivering. The key to this cultural change is going to be starting small and building momentum and moving it throughout the entire organization to get everybody on board with this new utility world. And then the other part of the human side of change is changing how utilities operate as organizations. This is all about organizational design. We've mentioned a few times bridging the silos across different departments within utilities. Valuing ESG is going to change the decision process at utilities. It's going to require much greater coordination across departments. If we think about system planning, for example, Transmission planning is going to have to be integrated with this distribution planning. We're going to have to ensure that we're making the most economical choices across the entire energy value chain. DERs and non-wires alternatives may be less expensive than traditional investments, and previously siloed departments are going to have to coordinate to make that assessment and plan investments accordingly.
Yeah, thanks, Andrea, for those thoughts there. And another type of value that decision analytics provides is that it helps utilities present the strongest possible case for investments to each of their core constituencies. So, Dawn, can you give us some examples of how a tool like Copperleaf can help utilities make a stronger case for investments, and how might the nuances of that case vary by constituency?
Yeah, great question. So again, this comes down to transparency, which we talked about several times during this discussion, and how Copperleaf supports customers in first making consistent decisions across their organization, and then optimizing their investment plans and capital budget. And finally, that's the last piece, right, in communicating and defending those plans to all of their stakeholders. So now different stakeholders have very different priorities, and they need to be addressed differently. So I'm gonna try to talk you through regulators versus investors versus insurers. Okay, so regulators, as we all know, care about compliance with their policies. So as an example, one of our clients, Value Framework, incorporates their electricity regulators' specific requirement to reduce SF6 gas emissions. This is a very highly potent greenhouse gas that is about 23,000 times more potent than CO2. And alongside of that, they need to reduce the SF6 emissions alongside other key metrics like price and public safety. So this client has used Copperleaf to clearly link investment choices, like the replacement of gas circuit breakers, to the regulator's policy, and therefore in turn, allowing this client to effectively communicate and defend their plan to the regulators for approval. Now, on the other hand, investors, they want to know that utilities are meeting their ESG obligations, especially if they're very ESG-centric and minded investors, and they want to see them doing that in the most economic way. So, for instance, like many organizations, one of our clients has a target of achieving net zero by 2050, and they anticipate steep increases in the carbon offset costs. So they were faced with the question of, what's my replacement strategy for my fleet of gas transmission compressor stations? Now, they have choices between a like-for-like replacement or replacement with a slightly more efficient modern model of a compressor, or they have the greener renewables-powered electric motor drive compressor as a third option. And Tom mentioned this earlier, right? Those greener options have a higher upfront acquisition cost. So how do we make sure we're taking into account all of the costs and scope 1, scope 2 emissions of each of the option, the lifetime carbon offset costs over 30 years, because we put these assets in there for 30, 40, 50 years at a time for how long they last. And we have to account for the carbon intensity of this operator's regional differences of the electricity grid that they're going to get the electricity from to power the compressors. Because again, the electricity in BC, in British Columbia, might be a very different carbon intensity than in Alberta, as an example. So because this client, their operations span many geographic areas. Now, with all that taken into consideration, the lifetime costs and benefits of different aspects, using Copperleaf, our client they were able to see that the last option, which is also the greenest option, the EMD alternative, is not only the greenest because it mitigates 50% of the carbon emissions compared to the first option of just like-for-like replacement, but also when you take into all of the costs into consideration, including the upfront acquisition cost, as well as the carbon offset costs that are going to be avoided over the next 30 years, then actually this is also the most economic option by up to 90% cost savings compared to the other options. And so that's a great ability to be able to demonstrate, yeah, we're not just doing good and doing the greenest thing, but it's actually also the most economic thing when you take into account all the costs associated with the investment. And imagine that if you can do that, that's just one fairly simple example, right? But if you can do that consistently across the network of assets, which can be in the millions, and you can do that across many organizations, geographic areas, that's the power of consistency to be able to demonstrate that you are indeed making the best decisions across the organization and that you can back it up to be able to demonstrate it with confidence. Now, finally, let's talk about insurers who care about risk reduction. Right, so Tom talked to a bit of this already, but insurers need to see plans to decrease flooding or wildfire risks in a tangible way in order to keep the the insurance premiums from skyrocketing, unfortunately. So we need to show that there are plans in place to address those catastrophic events that Tom was mentioning earlier. So for instance, as Tom was mentioning, storm hardening projects, right? They're an important part of some of Electra's capital plans. And within Copperleaf, they can effectively demonstrate to insurers, if needed, by pointing to those projects that work to decrease outages in their network due to major ice or windstorms and avoiding pole line failures that might have otherwise affected their customer service or public safety. So hopefully that gives you some ideas of how a solution like Copperleaf can help utilities make a stronger case for investments to regulators, investors, insurers. And we didn't even touch on the other stakeholders like employees and customers, but maybe we'll save that for another time.
Absolutely. Great points there. Thank you for walking us through that. And to wrap up our panel discussion, let's recap some key takeaways here. So advanced decision analytics that consistently value the ESG impact of investments across the board and communicate this to many constituencies can allow utilities to expand their definition of value, embed that expanded definition into all kinds of decisions, demonstrate the highest value plan, communicate that value to a broad range of constituencies. So now it's time for our panelists to take some audience questions. And just as a reminder, you can use the Q&A widget at the bottom of your webinar console window to submit those for our panelists today. So we have a few questions already, and so I want to jump right into these. And first question here is, changing the kinds of value we use in our planning and decisions will mean changing hundreds of business processes, reports, accounting, etc. How can we not get bogged down in all these little changes? Who would like to take that one on?
I have a couple of good ideas that I can share with the audience on this one. So I think it's really important, and I think as Darwin pointed out, to stay agile. Make sure that your processes and your decision-making tools that you're using are up to date and reflect what the current value measures that you're examining your investment decisions are. And I think that's the key benefit of a tool that centralizes all your investments under one portfolio, which is how we're using Copperleaf at Electra. And so by incorporating all the business cases into one repository and evaluating them using a consistent value framework, what we're allowed to do is enable the modifications and evolution of our value framework to then be used across all of the business cases. And so we do from on an annual basis, review all of the business cases that are pending for the next several years. And during that refresh, we have an opportunity to look through and reevaluate whether there's changing costs, they're changing benefits, and more importantly, changing risks to each particular investment. And so having a tool to prompt each particular project manager or business case writer to go through and incorporate those changes into the values or into the risks or into the benefits of each particular project ensures that every single time that you sort out a portfolio, you know that the most up-to-date and reflective investments are incorporated in your portfolio.
Yeah, and if I can just maybe add on to that, Tom, I think, how do you eat an elephant, right? One bite at a time. And Andrea mentioned this earlier as well. It's about starting small and then think big, however, but start small and start building wins towards that. And I think those kind of organizational and culture changes that Andrea spoke a lot about is very important to show those early wins and to get people championing that to be able to eventually eat the whole elephant at a time.
Excellent. Great points. Thank you both for jumping on that one there. Okay, next question here. How can utility regulators encourage utilities to present ESG valuation in their rate cases and IRPs? Can they require it? I'd like to take that one on.
I can tackle that one. So first I'll start by saying I think regulators are in a tough position right now. A lot of them are operating in regulatory frameworks that are not actually conducive to what the future that utilities are facing. And I think there's going to be a change that's required. And in some instances, regulators are being required to change those frameworks, and in others, they're lobbying for them to be changed so that they can have a better way of making sure that they're incorporating ESG into their own framework. I think the reality is that utility regulators will be able to play a key role to make sure that as we move towards that net zero future, we're doing it in a coordinated way. So not only across departments within a utility, but across the entire sector. What is that least cost pathway to net zero? And how can we make sure that there's a consistent framework in place at utilities to make sure that they're valuing the investments they're making appropriately so that it's incorporating those ESG elements, the three additional objectives which we spoke about throughout the time that we've been on today, into their own rate cases. And then utilities will be able to develop plans that are consistently aligned with that net zero future and make sure that we're getting least cost for customers. There will be required changes from a policy perspective. In some cases, as I mentioned, regulators are already being required to make sure that utilities are quantifying and assessing the risks associated with climate in the future. And that allows utilities to include those costs into their rate filing. And in some cases, we're not there yet. So there's progress that needs to be made. But certainly, I think key is going to be having that consistent framework to value ESG and then pulling the plans back to that and making sure that regulators have oversight over that process.
Yeah, great. Thank you for jumping on that question there. Okay, next question. What are some ways ESG valuation can be presented to investors? Where would we put this information so they understand how it affects investments? Dawn, I feel like that one might be directed towards you there first.
I can give it a try. We've actually interviewed quite a few investors to understand their perspectives. And I think that there's a three-part answer probably, because first, we should expect to see more requirements on disclosures on companies' ESG performance by the investors, just like the EU has already done that, and the SEC in the US is recently been very actively talking about it. So I think we will continue to evolve, but what gets measured gets managed, like the old saying goes, right? So it all starts with reporting requirements, and we can definitely, and we should expect to see those requirements come from those investors on disclosures. Now, secondly is what can the utilities actually do themselves? So it depends on how you've laid out your ESG strategy. So in our experience working with different clients and across the globe, in Europe, in Asia, as well as in Americas, some of them may focus on specific UN SDGs or sustainability development goals, and while others are focusing on the 6 capitals framework, and or other frameworks out there. So it'll be very beneficial, I think, to lay out for your investors how your capital plans are backing up each specific goal that you're speaking to, and how the timeline of your investment payoffs line up to the goals that show a tangible path to it over time. So back to the topic, right, from aspirational goals to operational plans, that needs to be paved with how your investment and what you're investing in and the payoffs are to demonstrate that tangible path. And finally, the last part of this answer, I think it's about scenario analysis and alternative analysis, because there are just so many different innovative technological options that are coming out. And frankly, some of the path and solutions to get to net zero today, it doesn't exist yet. And so being able to, with that agility of planning replanning as things change, as new technologies come on board, as carbon offset prices changes. Those scenario analysis, alternative analysis, to demonstrate to your stakeholders like an investor that you've actually been very thoughtful and methodical to evaluate different options that are available to you to be able to stitch together this best path. I think that's a very powerful thing if a utility can do that effectively. And so with all those three steps, I think it will go a long way towards increasing investor confidence.
Yeah, great points there. Thank you for taking that one on. Okay, let me get another question in here today. And that question is, this seems interesting, but overwhelming. Where can we start? I'd like to take on that one.
I have a couple ideas I could share. And so I think, like many companies, we've set very ambitious targets to get to net zero by 2050. And so now we start rolling up our sleeves and actually getting into the work. And as I identified earlier in the presentation, it's very straightforward to identify the low-hanging fruit. It's pretty straightforward to set aside resources to tackle some of these easy, low-hanging tasks. And eventually, you want to start looking at how to integrate all of those particular practices into your day-to-day operations, which means that you want to weave it into the day-to-day decisions, from everything from designing to procurement to execution, implementation. And when I think of some of the initiatives that we have with respect to good utility practices, I think of safety, and I think utilities do a really good job in implementing safety practices to the point where it's incorporated into the DNA of the organization. Well, in a similar manner, we see Electra sees sustainability in the same way, is that we want to think about it along every single step. And from that standpoint, incorporating thoughts around and ideas around how to be more sustainable, how to find solutions that reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. They're going to come from a variety of different departments, different contractors that we work with. And you want to have a tool in place that allows you to aggregate those, because individually those decisions may not seem so impactful until you aggregate all of those particular elements, look at them as a portfolio basis, and truly recognize the compounding effect that each of us can contribute to those elements. But the key component that we've been spending a lot of time about is how do we integrate this type of thinking into our day-to-day practice at Electra Utilities. We've started, we still got a long way to go, but I think once we utilize an expanded value framework and can identify where value comes from, I think it's much easier for individuals to bring ideas forward for suggestions and implementation.
Yeah, and Tom, if I could maybe just add on to that as well, I think you mentioned all the right points, and I think defining your ESG strategy is the starting point as well. Right? I know you guys are so along that path already, but for anyone looking to get started, just start defining your ESG strategy is great, knowing which areas you want to focus on in each of the environmental, social, and governance pillars. And I think that's why the Guidehouse team, Andrea and her team, are such experts in doing that. So that's, I think, gotta be the starting point of defining the ESG strategy. Now, once you do that, there's going to be a lot of decisions and trade-offs you have to make. That's what we talked about. And that, to me, is where creating the value framework to allow you to evaluate different investment options and projects on how you get to your goal. And that takes in the ESG, or resiliency, flexibility, sustainability goals, alongside the whole affordability, safety, and reliability goals. That value framework is going to be super important for you to govern your decision-making process. And I guess I'll just throw it out there that we actually have a playbook on Copperleaf to talk about how to build your value framework and how to think about it, and so that you can build a strong value framework to govern those decisions consistently and transparently. So do connect with us with Copperleaf if you want to know more as well. The Guidehouse team and Tom from Electra, I'm sure we would love to chat a lot more about this as well.
Thanks, Joanne. I think the only thing I would add is you hit it dead on in terms of defining the strategy first, and that is really where it all starts. And then it's defining those KPIs to support that strategy is really what's going to drive it home. That's where you start to dig in and identify what those value measures are, the consistent value measures that you're going to use to measure your own progress. And that's how you break that enormous problem into small initiatives that you're going to be able to prioritize and tackle over time as we go through this massive transformation that we're going through globally across all sectors.
Great points from all of you, and thank you so much for taking on those questions from our audience. We've reached the end of this webinar. As a reminder, if you submitted a question we did not have time to answer today, it will be answered in a follow-up email. I'd like to thank our panelists for sharing their insights and also our audience for joining us today. As a reminder, today's webinar will be available on demand and a link will be sent to your email. Thank you again and have a great day.